Hello and welcome to Module 3 of this RAI webinar series. These webinars are part of a TRL project with the aims of refining the methodology for RAI calculation, piloting application of the new methodology, and increasing awareness and use of the RAI in general. This presentation is part of a series. Each webinar in the series is a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes long, and some frequently asked questions are included at the end of each module. The webinars will cover the topics shown here. This third presentation covers RAI as it relates to rural development. We do recommend that you view these webinars in the sequence presented, but all the presentations will be made available separately and can be accessed as required. The topics covered in this presentation are the role of indicators in general, but also specifically for the RAI and rural development policy at various levels, regional, national, subnational, and program or project level, RAI targets, RAI as absolute numbers of population, and RAI as part of a suite of indicators. Any indicator must be defined for a specific purpose, and it must be linked to goals and policies and monitored through a dedicated framework. The same is true for RAI. RAI should be integrated with a country's rural development and transport strategies. Baseline values for RAI should be generated, policies and goals or targets should be established, plans and programs should be formulated, and of course the indicator should be monitored. It's important to note here that RAI should not be measured just for the purpose of SDG reporting. There is best practice available for defining indicators based around the SMART principles, where SMART is an acronym and S stands for specific. So what is the specific purpose of the indicator? For RAI, of course, this is to measure availability of infrastructure to rural populations. It's also important to specify at what level it needs to be applied. So for SDG reporting, it's national level, but the RAI can also be applied at subnational, project level, or even global regional levels. M stands for measurable, so exactly what is being measured should be clear, and this is laid out in the RAI methodology. A is for affordable, so it should not impose unreasonable extra costs or burden on those involved, and this is a key principle of the RAI. R is for relevant, so it should be linked to policies and goals and not measured in a vacuum. T is for time bound, so all targets should have a specified time frame. We're now going to talk about RAI in policies at the regional, national, subnational, and program or project levels. At the regional level, meaning global regions, there have been several examples of agreements in which countries commit to producing rural development strategies. For example, the Ashgabat Statement arose out of the first ever Global Sustainable Transport Conference in November 2016 in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. It reaffirmed commitment to support efforts to provide communities in rural areas with access to transport infrastructure and services. It introduced the concept of leave no one behind. Another example is the Vientiane Declaration in 2017, which demonstrated a commitment by government authorities and other stakeholders in the Environmentally Sustainable Transport Forum. The declaration expresses a commitment to assign due priority to rural transport projects and initiate the development of national strategies and policy frameworks to improve rural transport connectivity. This is very much in line with what the RAI is designed to measure. The SDG indicator for RAI is reported at a national level. At the national level, RAI is relevant because most countries explicitly include improving rural accessibility as part of their rural development strategies or transport strategies. Some countries specify RAI, or some variant of it, as the indicator by which to measure improved accessibility. In addition, many countries measure accessibility to services such as health and education in rural areas. Those countries that have integrated RAI in their national rural development policies include Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. RAI can also be measured at sub-national level. For some bigger countries, for example the USA, Russia, India, Nigeria, individual states have varying degrees of autonomy and will have their own rural development policies and goals at this sub-national level. RAI could be considered as an indicator at the state level in these countries. For medium-sized countries with some degree of local government mandate, the policy measures and indicators might be set by a national government, but local governments still have some autonomy to refine their indicators. Some countries have attempted to use RAI at the program or project level as a tool to monitor progress. The African Development Bank and the World Bank have supported such initiatives on their projects. The Ethiopian Universal Rural Roads Access Program, for example, uses RAI as a program indicator. So, as we mentioned earlier, all indicators should have a target. The next few slides discuss targets for the RAI. The Sum for All Global Roadmap of Action in 2019 was the first attempt to produce a plan to achieve sustainable mobility. It outlined a step-by-step approach consisting of quantifying the current transport situation in a country, identifying a catalogue of all possible public and private sector actions, and identifying appropriate policy measures to achieve sustainable mobility. The Global Roadmap of Action, or GRA, is an important document that is likely to be used by the international community for years to come. It sets a framework by which policies and programs can be devised, particularly for low and middle income countries. The GRA identifies an aspirational target for RAI of 100%. However, that target should depend on the country's circumstances and environment. Rural access should not be focused solely on roads and should also consider conservation or protection of fragile zones and the impacts of climate change. In addition, other transport modes can be significant for accessibility, for example footbridges in Nepal, river navigation in Bangladesh, coastal shipping in the Philippines, or rail in the Russian steppes. This graph shows estimated RAI as calculated using open source data. It suggests that countries in different regions of the world currently have different ranges of RAI values. This is not to say that countries in Africa, for example, should not aspire to the same levels as countries in Europe, but it does give a basis for looking at RAI according to different country groupings. We could also look at alternative groupings, such as archipelago countries or countries with important inland waterway networks, to allow comparison of similar characteristics. We have recommended further research into how targets should be set along these lines. We want to talk now about an alternative way to express RAI, which may help in better understanding and communicating the issue of rural accessibility and in using RAI in rural development policy. To date, RAI has been defined and presented as an index, which means it's expressed as a percentage. However, in addition to that percentage value, it's also important to consider the absolute numbers of people impacted by lack of all-season access. For this reason, we've recommended that RAI is presented wherever possible as absolute numbers. For example, if we say that there are 420 million people in Africa without access to an all-season road, it's a much more impactful statement than Africa has an RAI of 53%. The figures you can see here in this table are estimates for 2019 based on open source data. Another potentially useful aspect of the RAI is for planning and programming projects. It's easy to identify locations on maps that currently have limited access to the road network and to quantify the number of people impacted by road network activities. This helps to demonstrate the impact of projects through reduction in numbers of people without access, rather than a small increase in RAI. You can clearly see on this diagram pockets of population that are underserved by all-season roads. So presenting RAI as an absolute number at global, regional, national, and sub-national scales helps to make it more relevant to policymakers at all levels. RAI is SDG 9.1.1 and so is linked to Target 9.1 on infrastructure. SDG 9.1.2 is the only other indicator under this target. It measures passenger and freight volumes by mode of transport. Currently, it's a Tier 1 indicator based on reporting of air cargo data. There was a ReCAP 2020 study into scoping it out for other transport modes, for example road, rail, shipping, and to implement it as an SDG sub-indicator. This study is available on the ReCAP website and is also given in the references for this presentation. The Sum for All Global Roadmap of Action, which we referred to earlier, also defines a series of supporting indicators, in addition to RAI, on both the infrastructure and the services side, and you can see these listed here. It's important to note that infrastructure indicators are clearly differentiated from service indicators. In the supplemental guidelines to the RAI developed by TRL, we also included a draft paper on secondary indicators. Many people gain access to services via infrastructure that is not all-season roads, for example using motorcycle tracks and navigable waterways. This type of access cannot be included in the RAI because the definition is already set and relates specifically to all-season roads. However, access using intermediate means of transport does need to be recognized, so there is some scope to develop additional indicators. This type of access could be measured through incorporation of tracks and jetties into OpenStreetMap, as an example. So this module has been the third in the series of 7 modules on the RAI. All other modules are available on the ReCAP YouTube channel and on the World Bank Data Catalog website. Key references for the information given in this presentation are given here, so please refer back to these as needed. So here we're going to cover some frequently asked questions which relate to the topics we've just presented. So the first question is the RAI a good indicator at the project level? So we think it certainly can be. And we know, for example, that it has actually been used as an indicator in the Ethiopia Universal Rural Roads Access Program, where it was used as a program indicator in percentage terms. Now, we mentioned during the presentation that it's important to present RAI in absolute numbers of people affected as well as a percentage index. And this is probably especially true when looking at specific road projects or programs, since the percentage change to RAI may be very small, but this could actually be hiding large population numbers who could be affected positively by the project. The second question, variants of the RAI are sometimes used in some countries, and can you give some examples? So a good example is Nepal, where a variant to the RAI is used to really account for the specific challenges of the geography and the terrain of that country. So in Nepal, they've used a modified definition of the population living within 5 kilometers from national roads specifically. Other variants include some countries using walking time as a measure of distance to an all-season road rather than the 2 kilometers specified by the RAI. Other countries also use the distance from village centres in some cases. Question 3, are there any countries which use RAI at the state or regional level? So the answer is not that we know of, but as we discussed during the presentation, it could certainly be useful for larger countries such as Russia and Brazil, or even the US. And it's especially potentially useful in cases where the subnational administrations have some degree of autonomy in setting their own transport or rural development policies and plans.
So there was one question for webinar 3, and that was, how often is it recommended to report the RAI? Well, the RAI doesn't change very frequently, on average every 3 to 5 years. The recommended frequencies for calculation are given in the supplemental guidelines based on the following parameters. For countries where there's major road construction or rehabilitation programs, it's recommended to be measured annually. For countries with rapid urbanisation or where there's been conflict or economic disaster or major natural disasters, it should be measured every 2 years. For countries with an RAI of 95% or more, every 5 years, and all other countries every 3 years.
So thank you for watching this webinar. We hope you found it useful. You can find more information on the ReCAP website and in the references provided during this presentation. You can also access the other modules in this series via the ReCAP YouTube channel and on the World Bank Data Catalog website.